I'm Jim Scheer, host of 180 Degrees, a podcast brought to you by the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. In this series, I talk to climate leaders about how they first connected to the urgent need for climate action. We go back to their roots and talk about their journeys, discover what drives them and what keeps them motivated. We also explore the essential ingredients required for leadership on climate action here in Ireland and how we might impact internationally. Nothing short of a societal movement is now needed to ensure a livable planet for our children and future generations.
Today I'm delighted to welcome Claire Dupont, a professor at Ghent University whose research examines the policy, politics and governance of the transformation to sustainability and climate neutrality in Europe. We're going to talk about her research and reflections on how Ireland is perceived internationally and the need for a broader conversation around our social and economic paradigms. Claire, you're very welcome to the podcast. I've really been looking forward to this conversation. I'd like to start by hearing a little bit about you, first of all, your interests and qualifications and your area of expertise.
So I'm a research professor at Ghent University in Belgium. My background is mostly in political science. I did my PhD in political science at the Free University of Brussels in Belgium as well. But my research is really around European climate policy, but also its connections with environment and energy policy and European policy and politics more broadly.
It's such an interesting set of topics, and I'm really interested in how you first got connected to this subject matter and how you ended up where you are geographically.
I grew up on a farm in County Clare, so I was always really connected to nature. So I guess that might be part of the origin story. But I did my bachelor's and master's programs at the University of Limerick. And I studied languages with politics in my bachelor's program. And then I moved on to a master's of international studies. And I kind of thought that what I wanted to do was work in the development world. And I tried to get in there. So I ended up doing quite a lot of interviews for various jobs with the UN agencies and their graduate programs, and never quite making it. And I asked once, I think it was the third or fourth interview, I asked, why am I not getting the job? And they just said, you need field experience. So I was like, all right. So I took out a bank loan and I moved to Tanzania for a year and spent all the money I had and had to move back when the money ran out. But in the course of that year of living in Tanzania, I figured out that this wasn't really for me, in the sense that I couldn't quite grasp the distance between what communities said they needed and what individuals said they needed in terms of their development needs and what these big international organizations were telling them they had to do and how to spend the money and where to get the money and all these kinds of conditions that were assigned to it. So I became quite quickly disillusioned with that whole world of development. And this is back in 2007. I understand it's evolved since then. But at that time, I couldn't picture myself working there anymore. So that was like a bit of an existential crisis, I suppose, because that was what I had been working towards. And then discovering that wasn't for me was a bit of a challenge. Mm-hmm. So in the last few weeks, I'd say, of my time in Tanzania, I started thinking about what do I do next. And I was looking for master's programs. I had thought about doing a master's program in forestry management, actually. And then I was like, I like research, so maybe I should look into that.
Yes.
And just kind of by chance, there was a research position open at the Free University of Brussels as a research assistant, where I would get to work with Professor Sebastian Obertur, who has been working on global climate politics and European climate politics since the 90s. So he was really high up expert on the issue. And working with him as an assistant, then I also got the opportunity to pursue a PhD. And very quickly, this is a topic that I grasp as like, this is really fascinating work and something that needs to be done. And I kind of also thought about it as, well, you know, as a natural follow-on from my desire to work in development, because the developed countries have other issues to think about. So clearly in Europe, we should be focusing on managing a safe planet for the future for them to also develop.
Yeah, it sounds to me like quite a courageous sort of journey of discovery, and you sort of sensed your way through it and kind of followed the signs. And hearing that you're from a farm in County Clare and now, I guess, working in the centre of Europe, researching big topics which we're gonna talk about. Looking back, do you now feel that working on issues related to climate are somehow linked to some early connection with nature back in County Clare, or?
Yeah, this is also kind of like the midlife realization of who you are. I guess I grew up with this very strong connection to nature. I spent a lot of my time outside, playing outside. I loved being with, especially we had a few sheep on the farm. I loved being with the lambs in the springtime. But I kind of assumed that was what everybody experienced, that everybody had a connection with nature. And it's only in adult life that I realized that there isn't actually an automatic connection to nature inside many people or with many people. So I do see it now in kind of as a full circle, vision, but I wouldn't have thought about it like that before.
Let's get into a bit of your research and hear a bit about it. Time is of the essence. The climate crisis is happening now. Reports and scientific studies are advising us that the devastating impacts of climate change are already happening more frequently, and that there's a lot more to come unless we really change our game. And at the same time, we know a lot about the technologies that we're going to need to solve the problem. And we also understand a lot about the economics of the transition in terms of costs and benefits, but we still haven't caused the rate of change that's needed, and we still haven't seen the drastic emissions reductions needed. What do you see, and from your research, that might be missing that could make a difference here?
So my research for my PhD was about climate policy integration. This is going back in the late 2000s, early 2010s, where I was examining the way European energy and climate policy was developed and how coherent it was. And as part of that study, it became clear that in the process of making policy, you need to have you need to have the right voices and the right knowledge in the process. And if you don't have a sufficient degree of, say, scientific expertise, but also just pro-climate and environment voices, that those become, as we say, drowned out by other interests. And those interests are not necessarily interests for the common good. Those would be interests for maximizing profit or certain industries. So it became very clear, I think, very early on in my research that there's something to do with imbalances of power and how decisions are made that are really crucial for understanding why we are failing so far on addressing climate change adequately. And that I've been building on that work in different ways since then. So I've also started to look more at the role of scientific expertise and knowledge in decision-making processes, and also the role of knowledge in community and societal discourses in general. And there we do see that, science can be a base for putting an item on the agenda, getting the discussion going. But again, we see as the discussion moves forward that there are power structures that drown out the science-based knowledge, and that these power structures are really so embedded that we don't really know how to deal with them, or we don't even try to deal with them, because sometimes we don't even see the power structures that are there. So I think the research that I'm working on now is really about trying to reveal those power structures and trying to highlight that these exist and that these are the sorts of things we need to overcome. Because actually the solutions are available. It's about making sure that we implement them quickly, but that we have to recognize that the barriers to implementing them are not their existence or not, but are the power structures that we have created in our society that are very deeply embedded.
That's fascinating. And if I could perhaps present the landscape as I see it at the moment in Ireland, and based on some recent research by Ireland's Ep8 that looked at society's attitudes to climate and climate action. And what we're seeing there is that Ireland, even somewhat uniquely, even on a European or global scale, are very aware engaged and concerned about climate as an issue. Those at the denial end of the scale are very, very few, and those at the highly concerned end of the scale are very many. And we've had efforts like the Citizens Assembly, which brought together a representative group of citizens, and they were presented with scientific information on this, and that led to a report to the Oireachtas. And I think we now have a very strong legislative framework. We have strong climate action plans, and so in the power systems here, and also in society, there seems to be a high level of awareness and engagement, and a serious approaching of the topic. Yet the scoreboard still ticks over. Now, I don't want to downplay the great efforts being made, but there still seems to be some ingredients missing. In that context, how would you apply your research, and what do you see, or what do you hear in that?
I think there's a lot to be very pleased about in the Irish context. Certainly sitting here in Belgium, I'm almost jealous of how things have advanced in Ireland in terms of the discussion societally. Here we still have denier voices. Here we still have, climate and environment issues being hijacked by political interests across a very broad spectrum. We have also quite a significant extremes left and right of the party spectrum that are very much downplaying the urgency and even sometimes denying the need to take climate action. So in Ireland, I think you have a really strong foundation to build towards something important. And I believe, so I don't have the research to back this up, but my hunch is, seeing what things are from in Belgium, is that the citizens' participation processes and the fact that there was this climate law adopted quite some years ago has really helped drive forward the discussion in that positive way. Your question is more about how we can build on that, given that the implementation is still lacking. I mean, the first thing to recognize is that implementation is lacking everywhere. So we are all in this process of scrambling to catch up on the promises that we made 20 years ago. We have not been implementing. And in fact, even when we have been implementing, it's been the easy solutions. It's been, the technological fixes, a few, increasing our renewable energy share. There's more to it than that now, and we know it. And it has to move more quickly. And the research that I've been doing doesn't necessarily help us to speed up in the short term, but I think there's opportunities for us to speed up in the long term, and that's not great news, I guess, from the urgency that the climate scientists are telling us. But there is a high risk if we don't do it in a participative manner that we end up entrenching more the polarization around the issue, which in Ireland so far has not been the case, but in other countries is. So I have colleagues, for example, who work really closely with communities, so working at a very local level, and it's slow work. And working with them about, in a very participative process, establishing what the issue is, how can we contribute. And the idea would be that not that these processes get scaled up, but that they multiply. So the faster those processes multiply, then you think the faster we can have solutions, because there is this kind of idea that with enough critical mass, we can overcome the power structures that are holding us back. But that critical mass doesn't hold the power in decision making at the broader societal level, which is why local communities often are the ways forward. So it's slow, with the idea that multiplication of these slow participative processes may be the way forward.
Got it. And it's certainly an avenue we're pursuing here in Ireland. I think we have over 700 sustainable energy communities around the country, and we're connecting them to resources and supports to start that grassroots. But it raises an interesting question for me, because, there's often criticism of the climate movement, if you like, for putting it all on the consumer or putting it all on communities to sort out the problem, where we know there are some systemic issues that we've developed ourselves, but we're now part of as society. that we need to hear that others are doing things too, perhaps to motivate us. What do you see in that kind of framing of climate sort of energy and the movement on communities versus making that more of a societal effort and top down versus bottom up efforts, I guess?
I see that as a symptom of the failure of our governments. For me, it is the government's responsibility to disentangle or even remove these blocking power structures. But our government, in many cases, or our governments in many countries, are as much part of the power structure that exists as the ones who are able to manage it and govern it. So I see it's like the result of the fact that our governments have failed, that now we've had to change our approach because we're feeling the urgency. We're feeling the effects of climate change. We're feeling the effects of biodiversity loss, and for too long our governments have been too slow. And so it should be governments that are governing these powerful actors. It should be governments that are dismantling the unfair and societal structures, but instead they tend to uphold these structures. And we talk about this as like status quo, maintaining the status quo, but I always find that's also a very strange way of thinking, because society is changing all the time and governments are riding these changes, and they see politicians and political actors, they see the changes and they're doing all their best to respond and to be part of the change. So they could do more to steer and to guide, and that's what they haven't been doing. And I think that's also, I don't want to say that politicians are dishonest, but I think there is a lack of honest discussion with the public about what this really means, this fact of climate change, this fact of biodiversity loss, and creating a vision of the future that is actually better for the majority of people, even though it may be worse for a minority. And that's where the discussion is not happening sufficiently, I think, in general societal discourse across the EU.
It's a really interesting insight, and it made me think, have you seen in your years of experience there in central government any examples of brave political moves or actions that are heading in the kind of direction that you're saying we should be more, we should be exploring more, and I'm particularly interested in that visioning of the future. Have you seen anything interesting along those lines?
In terms of brave political actors, I think I'm quite impressed with the current European Commission and with the European Commission's president and executive vice president. So that's Ursula von der Leyen as the president and Franz Timmermans as the executive vice president. And I'm impressed with them because my research has been saying the European Commission should do this for 15 years, and then they did it. They presented an overarching integrated policy plan, and they followed up with a whole ream of strong policy measures, and they are fighting for it. I think there's a lot of bravery also now, or political courage from the Commission when it comes to fighting for this nature restoration law, which I know is a topic of discussion in many countries in Europe. And I'm very pleased to see that they're fighting for it, because politically it would be much easier to step back and say, okay, we're just the executive arm of the EU. In fact, it's not our job to make these political decisions, but they understand the critical nature of some of these proposals. So there I see courage, and I'm pleased about it. I wish I saw more of it in the rest of the European institutions. And the other place where I see courage is in some cities. So we have a bit of a gap at the national level, I think. So far, there aren't many political actors at the national level really stepping up. But maybe the top-down, bottom-up pressure from certain innovative cities and from this commission can help to drive things forward overall. And on the vision, I'm afraid this is where we all fall down. I don't know if you remember, Jim, around the time of the Copenhagen climate negotiations, I think it was then 2009, there was this cartoon that was making the rounds, which was just a picture of a list of all the things that we needed to change to combat climate change, such as, tackling air quality, dealing with emissions in transport and noise levels, thinking about tackling social inequality. And then there's two commentators looking at this PowerPoint slide saying, what if climate change is a hoax and we create a better world for nothing? And it just perfectly sums up the absurdity of the fact that we cannot produce a vision that is inspiring to people. I mean, let's think about the language that we're using. The European Green Deal, the green transition. What do these words mean to people? And I think that's where we need a lot more artists and creative people and writers helping us in thinking about what the future could look like if we actually succeed in moving to a climate neutral society.
It's such an interesting point, and it's often, it seems to me, and maybe it could be a function of where I'm working in a sort of a technical institution, the part that I'm working in anyway, providing data and insights to government to make good decisions, is so far removed from art and culture and those streams. And I often wonder if we're missing certain skill sets at the top tables when we're talking about addressing climate change. Sounds like we might be.
I think so. I think we end up making climate change like a doom story. And it is, in fact. We cannot deny it. Things are bad. It's bad. Climate change, it's bad. Biodiversity loss, it's bad. But the opportunity to transform our society into something good, into something inspiring, into something that people would want, in a place where people would want to live, those opportunities are huge, but we don't talk about those. We don't talk about how beneficial it would be. We end up with these cost-benefit analyses that count pennies and cents, and those fall on the side of the cost of implementing these changes because it means change, as opposed to the benefits for well-being or mental health or happiness or, many other things that people value in life that is hard to quantify.
If we could give the politicians a break for a second and imagine their job is very hard and they need to stay popular as well as, come up with good policies in order to have the power to make the policies. There's a bit of a cycle there. Do people have time to consider these beautiful visions of the future when maybe they're struggling with issues of their own? And I don't mean any issues, the cost of living crisis at the moment. Do these visionary pieces land into the general populace in a way that's tangible and achievable if it means them spending a bunch of money on an EV or on a house upgrade? Is there a discord there for groups of society, or have you any thoughts around that?
Yeah, that also brings us back into the system individual discussion. If the only solution is to buy an electric vehicle, then the system has failed. The solution should be about reducing the personal financial costs by providing better public services. And so if those public services are available, that's also a form of redistribution of inequality and of wealth. And so if you have better public services where everybody can equally access, then that reduces the need for personal financial costs for these sorts of transitions.
That's an excellent example. And I was also thinking when you were talking about those good examples that you'd seen at the European level and at the cities level, and just now what you said, are they examples to you of the kind of system change that's being called for?
Yeah, I think that's a tricky question. So I live in a city, I think, where there is system change happening. Ghent City in Belgium is a real front runner in terms of trying to have a livable city, where the city itself is quite compact geographically. There's a very progressive mobility plan. There's lots of efforts to have lots of green spaces. There's social services are very high quality. The quality of life you can have in a city like this is very high without having to have very high personal income.
Okay.
And I think that's the kind of system change that we need to look for. And, I don't own a car. I don't need a car because the services are available for me. For example, I don't need to spend half of my income on childcare because the services are state and income weighted and state funded and well organized, and there's no waiting list. Things like this. This is the system change that's needed. And that system change is very hard to implement just at the city level. And it's very hard to implement just at the international level. There needs to be kind of an alignment across the different levels of governance, because of course the level of governance that raises taxes the most is the national level. That's the federal government in Belgium, but the national level in Ireland. So it needs to be part of an understanding of why do we raise taxes and what do we use those taxes for. And then, if that contributes to a higher quality of life through public services, then you have the system change that is inspiring and that is necessary. In the EU, at the EU level, I've talked about there is political courage, but it's also starting from like a fairly low benchmark, in the sense that the EU's mission and raison d'être forever has been about economic growth and jobs. And the European Green Deal tries, and the European Commission, who's leading this, of course, they try to steer that vision in a certain direction, but the underlying vision remains. It's still quite economic growth, jobs focused, without necessarily thinking about another vision for our economy and society. And I think that's where maybe more research could help, but also I think more courage and different visions would be needed. But that as we see, takes quite some time to develop and translate into relevant policy making language.
It's an excellent reflection. I think a recent speech by Ireland's President, Michael D. Higgins, made to Ireland's Think Tank for Action on Social Change, or TASC. He talked about post-growth economics, and I think that took some courage, and it certainly attracted both a bunch of support and a heap of criticism from the mainstream as well. And in it, I guess he talked about his perception of Ireland's reactive or narrow model of policy making, and how that may have gotten in the way of, and maybe that narrow focus on economic growth, which I don't think is quite so narrow at the moment. I think those that aren't just focused on GDP, they're thinking very much about what other societal benefits can happen, but that perhaps an over focus on growth has got in the way of a more proactive social engagement on structural issues like alternative economic models. How do you think we could reclaim some space for that conversation?
Yeah, this is, if I also may say, I think Michael D. Higgins' speech really had lots of waves across Europe as well. It was reported in the newspapers here in Belgium, and it was part of discussions about, look, there is a president of a member state of the European Union who dares to make a speech like this. Surely we should be having these conversations. So I actually really appreciate the fact that that speech happened, because it opened space already for, whether that was in Ireland or abroad, for some real reflection on, well, what are we trying to achieve and how are we going to do it? So yeah, I think that discussion needs to be built upon. But it also is interesting, the reaction to it, because that discussion itself and the reactions to it reveals some of those power structures we were talking about. It reveals the habits and traditions of policy making, where economic analysis is what we go for, is the basis or the foundation of our political and policy decision making. And that sort of structure is a reflection of, the wider vision that we maybe have for society. And if that vision is changing, then necessarily the sorts of knowledge and input into our decision making also needs to change. So then we need to think more about community actors. We need to think more about teachers being part of our decision making process. We need to think more about medical doctors being in the decision making process about environmental issues, artists. There's many other visions that we could have for what our key aim for is in society, beyond this idea of economic growth as it has long traditionally been defined. And I also agree with you. I think that definition is shifting, and I'm kind of happy to see that.
And you mentioned a few different cohorts of society, like teachers, medical doctors, and artists, who have all been very vocal actually themselves on the climate crisis, but maybe haven't been in the room having the conversations about the climate issue in the decision-making room, even though their voices are being heard loud and clear in terms of the activism. So I am interested in that sort of entrenched view of the political making system, and from the governance point of view, what have you learned about how we can alter that sort of, how do we get out of the entrenched way of thinking and into those broader issues like looking at sufficiency, equality, and just transition, all of which are so important?
I don't think we have any very good examples of how to get out of it yet. Certainly not in the Western world. I think we do have some examples of places that never really fell into it, but they're quite small regions of the world. I think in Bhutan, Costa Rica, they have even Ecuador now is starting to come up as they're countries with different visions for our place in nature, I guess, as well. And so in the Western world, if I can call it like that, Europe, going beyond Western Europe, but the whole of Europe, North America, etc., we don't really have good examples because we haven't succeeded. So the only thing we can do right now is experiment with what we think could be helpful, and that's part of that is the processes I mentioned earlier about working with communities. I think something very key is bringing in these other voices, like making sure that they are part of decision making, whether it's at community or national level. I think I would argue more that they need to be part of the national discussion and national decision making, but at least starting somewhere. More of these participative processes like citizens' assemblies, as long as they're meaningful and as long as there is follow-up on those processes to make them meaningful. And we need connectors. We need a huge connection and acknowledgement across all the issues that we're dealing with, that actually, nature and our climate system and our biodiversity system, and this is at the basis of everything that we can do in society, so we need to be careful to maintain them of good quality. So it's a bit of a vague answer, but I think the thing is that if we can identify the power structures, have a strong education process also that allows us to, as communities and societies, identify these power structures and then be able to always protect ourselves from the interests that go beyond the general public good that these powers push, then perhaps we have a chance of using all these different tools to move us in a different direction.
What you talked about there sounded much more collaborative. So I think there's a lot of streams happening in Ireland that are along the lines of what you're talking about. So I'm encouraged that we should keep pursuing those, but perhaps bringing them to the top table more often.
Yeah, I mean, I look at Ireland and I'm quite encouraged, and I know that people in Ireland maybe are not experiencing it in that way if they're in this community, but speaking from Belgium, it could be much worse.
Yeah, I'm really interested in your view of Ireland and how you think we're perceived internationally.
I think Ireland is an interesting small country because it is. If I tell people I'm from Ireland, their eyes light up and they're just delighted and they want to talk to me about their trip to Ireland they had 20 years ago and how it was life-changing and how beautiful it is. People, for some reason, have some weird connection to this idea of Ireland, and basically everybody is friendly towards us. I mean, we don't have major historical problems with any of our partners in Europe. So I think Ireland is in a position, and it does in fact do this, really punch above its weight in an international setting. And particularly now in Europe since Brexit, Ireland has become, I would argue, more vocal, more important. It doesn't partner with the UK anymore. It has to find other partners. Not that it always partnered with the UK, but that was something easy to do. And I see that Ireland is not necessarily seen as an example when it comes to environment issues, but it is working in coalition with other member states that are trying to push things forward more than it used to. I think that is thanks largely to the fact that there are green party members in government, and in quite a few other European member states that they work together across borders. So you have Green Party members in government also in Belgium, and those ministers work well together. And so there are new coalitions forming. And where Ireland was not necessarily pushing for ambitious policy in the EU previously, now in some files at least, and some policy decisions and discussions, they are among the more ambitious groups of countries. So I think possibly Ireland becomes an example in some aspects, because it's a small country that also, it's an example for sure for new member states to the EU as the ideal of how countries entering the European Union need to develop because of its economic status, its economic development, which is astronomical compared to some of the other countries in the EU. It's such a wealthy place, Ireland, and yet there's so much more to be done in many fields, of course. So it's a bit of a strange mix.
You attended the recent Beyond Growth conference in Brussels, and this is actually how we connected. So I rarely go on Twitter these days, but I jumped on and you were reporting live from the conference, and I thought, what's this about? This I'm interested in this. And can you tell us what the Beyond Growth conference was about, please?
The Beyond Growth conference was organised by a group of MEPs, of cross-party MEPs at the European Parliament. I think it was from 8 different political parties, including the European People's Party, the Greens, and so on. So these 8 MEPs came together to form the core basis of the organising group. I think altogether there were more MEPs than that. And the idea was to have a discussion in the European Parliament about, should we move beyond in Europe this idea of economic growth? What else is there? What should we be thinking of? And the conference brought together quite a lot of civil society actors, so, NGOs and activists, and also industry representatives, I think a smaller cohort of those, research organizations, academics, a whole bunch of people to talk about these questions. And it was organized in a way that you had quite large plenary discussions with a large audience, and then in the Zoom talk, like breakout rooms where you had smaller panels diving deeply into other topics. As far as I know, all of the sessions are still available online, so anybody can have a look. But that conference for me felt kind of important in this, what we were talking about earlier, how the discussion societally and in the policy world is moving. I think it was important because there were several thousand people who were either following it online or attending in person. And you had very high-level political actors in the EU giving speeches there, including the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Parliament, and various other political actors. And just that there was this loud demand for moving the discussion beyond measuring GDP, beyond thinking just about economic growth, and thinking more in terms of one of the words we used in that conference a lot was well-being, thinking about what it is to live a fulfilling life, and that we should have societal structures and systems that help us to pursue a fulfilling life and meaningful life, as opposed to pursue the accumulation of wealth or the accumulation of income to provide for our own personal security and well-being. So this idea of always chasing to cover your expenses. And so that was, I think, quite meaningful in that regard, that the conversation anyway just took place. But yeah, I feel like this was part of the setting of vision. It didn't quite get there, I think, in terms of moving outside of the language that is very much embedded in the academic discussion here, where we talk about beyond GDP, post-growth, degrowth. A lot of these words are also not very meaningful for people in their everyday lives. But I think it was the beginning of a discussion on visioning for the future that's maybe alternative. I think the trouble is more that we get stuck on the vocabulary that we use, and then that vocabulary becomes divisive. And instead, we need to be able to have discussions that are inspiring and allow us to envision a future that, makes us get up to work towards. We want to get there, so let's move it. Let's implement these policies. Let's decide on them together, and let's do it.
It's a real call to action for those other fields like the marketeers and those promoting this around the need for an inviting and creative language around this, and then back to the artists and the whole society. The whole of society's role in this movement starts to become clear in these conversations, even when you start talking about GDP and at the start of the college, so that's really interesting. Can we bring it back finally to your own research and what you're really interested in at the moment, and what your focus on maybe for the next 6 or 12 months might be?
So I've got two projects that I'm working on at the moment, and one is really about the evolution of scientific knowledge, and by that I mean very multidisciplinary. So not just the number crunchers, as you call it, but also social sciences and humanities, and their involvement in policy making at the EU level, and how that has changed. And how it has changed, and whether it has changed, and where there are still challenges. So that's part of my work. And connected to that, I also have a kind of a reflective process on knowledge development in general. How do we develop our knowledge? We kind of have this very siloed structure of knowledge development, certainly in the third level sectors, which is not really fit for purpose in terms of the challenges that we're trying to resolve at the moment in society. There doesn't seem to me to be any point in keeping the social sciences separate from humanities and natural sciences and medical sciences when we're talking about the life-supporting earth systems that we all need and the underlying foundations of our whole society and civilization. I think there needs to be some way of thinking about the construction of knowledge, and also about how that knowledge is kept within these walls, whether at school or at university. I also feel that needs to change. So I'm doing some work around that. And then a separate piece that I'm working on is a project that will be beginning soon, which is about soil biodiversity. And this is me practicing what I preach, where I'm working very closely with lots of biologists and ecologists to really try and translate their knowledge into participative community discussions. So that will be kicking off, officially it kicked off the 1st of June, so it's a 5-year project that will be running, and that will keep me busy for a while.
It sounds like it from the macro of knowledge systems to the micro of soil biology, and it sounds like a pretty broad spectrum. And we will follow with huge interest, Claire. And it's been fascinating to talk to you today. And I'd like to talk to you for hours more. And I hope we keep up an engagement and a dialogue between Belgium and your research and Ireland. Thank you so much, Professor Claire Dupont, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. We hope you enjoyed our conversation and it's left you in action and hopeful for our future. Please visit seai.ie/podcast for information on each of our guests this season and links to further relevant material to support you around your own climate actions, or resources if you are suffering from any climate anxiety. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to 180 Degrees and rate the podcast to help us spread the word.